So let's look at the War of 1812. The United States' inability to stop Great Britain and France from interfering with its trade ships is going to greatly heighten these tensions between the U.S. and these two countries of Britain and France. The British practiced impressment, capturing merchant sailors and forcing them to serve in the British Navy. And this also leads to deteriorating relationships between the U.S. and Great Britain. Since many of the sailors captured were naturalized American citizens, and finally, the problems with Britain became great enough to push these two nations to the brink of war. There's two factions in Congress that arise during this time period. Of course, we have conflict, and both sides are going to firmly believe in what they want, which are opposing things. The war hawks, mostly from the West and South, are going to support a war with Great Britain. They had as motivation the desire for westward expansion and believed that the British were lending support to Native American resistance in the West, such as, for example, the Shawnee. So most New Englanders, on the other hand, are going to oppose war with Britain. They're going to fear that war is going to further damage New England merchants and their shipping trade. Again, it's coming down to money for them. So on June 1st, 1812, President Madison is going to ask Congress to declare war against Britain. He's going to cite the continuing disruption of American trade, the growing tensions in the West, and on June 16th, the British government announced that it would repeal its orders to interfere with American trade ships. And this announcement might have avoided war if we had received the message in time. But because communication over the Atlantic Ocean is going to take a lot of days, we're not going to hear about the British declaration, and we're going to officially declare war on them on June 18th. So if we would have had a cell phone, we could have picked it up and called and said, hey, the British repealed their declaration to attack our ships, which is what this war is over, so let's work this out. We potentially could have avoided the War of 1812. But since that didn't happen and cell phones didn't exist at that time, let's talk about the War of 1812. The American military found itself very ill prepared for war with Britain, underfunded, low on both troops and ships. Adding to the challenges, a large minority of Americans opposed this war. And so New England actively is going to try to dampen the war effort by withholding troops and funding. Most battles in the war are going to take place in the Great Lakes region along the border between the U.S. and British-controlled Canada. The U.S. strategy is going to involve invading Canada from Detroit, the Niagara River, and Lake Champlain, which is between northern New York and Vermont. And the earliest attempt to take Canada fails, and the British force themselves into U.S. territory at Detroit and Lake Champlain. Owing to its small navy, the U.S. had to contract with private ship owners to help fight much of the battles against this one of the best navies in the world. So, nevertheless, the U.S. Navy managed to win some battles. The Battle of Lake Erie in April of 1813, for example, allows the U.S. to take control of most of Michigan and forces the British to retreat from Detroit, which the British are going to capture in 1812. The major battles. In autumn of 1813, the United States is going to unsuccessfully attempt to capture the Canadian city of Montreal, which is going to result in the British occupation and burning of Buffalo, New York. Napoleon's defeat in Europe allows Britain to send more troops to fight in the U.S., and despite this increase, the newly trained U.S. military won the Battle of Chippewa, which is across the Niagara River from Buffalo, in the summer of 1814. The British forced the Americans out of Canada in a subsequent battle, and after the United States Navy defeated British ships on Lake Champlain, the British retreated into Canada. But in August of 1814, the British took Chesapeake Bay, and they're going to sail up the Potomac River into Washington, D.C., which was our capital at the time. And here they're going to burn the White House, parts of what is now the Capitol, and other government buildings. And the United States forces are going to turn the British back in the Battle of Fort McHenry in Baltimore. It was here at Fort McHenry where some Francis Scott Key was in a neutral boat out in the waters watching this battle take place, and he writes the poem that's later put to music, and we now know that as the Star-Spangled Banner. So New Englanders are going to become increasingly angry about this war, to which they largely oppose, which is going to greatly hamper their economic interest. They resented what they perceive as Madison's heavy-handed military strategies, and the War Department is going to refuse to fund state militias and instead insist that the U.S. dictate all military activity in the region. So some took this as Madison's retribution for New England's refusal to obey instructions from the War Department. The Federalist Party is still dominates New England, and the Federalists did not support France. They therefore are objected to Madison's fight against the British, fearing it would help strengthen France. And in 1814, 26 New England delegates that are mostly from Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. And let's think for just a second about those three states at this point, but colonies before, where most of the dissension and conflict comes from during time of settlement. Connecticut and Rhode Island were founded by people who dissented from the majority of the Massachusetts, and the Massachusetts founders, the Puritans and the Pilgrims themselves, were dissenters from England. So these guys have a history of disagreeing with a lot of things. So these 26 New England delegates are going to meet in Hartford, Connecticut. Many people in New England had been discussing the possibility of seceding, moving away, pulling away from the Union, or voting to expel Western states from the Union. Some of the more radical secessionists wanted to negotiate a peace treaty with Britain, completely separate from any made by the United States government. And if you look at the Constitution that we just studied in the last chapter, states aren't allowed to do that. So they were looking at doing something that was completely unconstitutional. Continuing on this, the convention lasted 3 weeks, and it's going to consist of secret meetings for which no written records were kept. Again, think about the last point I just made. There's a reason why they're not keeping written records on this. Harrison Gray Otis, the convention's leader, is going to manage to block the more radical proposals, and at the convention's conclusion, the delegates issued a report that asserted New England's right and duty to actively oppose infringements upon its sovereignty that it deemed unconstitutional. And that to me sounds a lot like states' rights. Okay, New England's going to say we have the right to be sovereign and we have the right to not do what the federal government wants us to do. But we know when we enter into that treaty, contract, with the United States government, that we agree to follow the Constitution, we agree to give up a little bit of our rights, that we lose that ability. So it also proposed that the U.S. Constitution be amended to make it more difficult for the federal government to restrict trade or wage war, and to reduce the power of the southern states by removing the provision that slaves could be counted in the census. Remember, the Three-Fifths Compromise comes from the Constitutional Convention, where we agree to count slaves as 3/5 of a person for representation and taxation purposes. So the Hartford Convention delegates almost certainly knew that Congress would not approve their proposals, and instead they intended to embarrass President Madison and draw attention to their grievances against him, his war strategies, and even the Democratic-Republican Party in general. So we still see conflict between these Federalists and these Democratic-Republicans. Nevertheless, Massachusetts sent 3 delegates to negotiate the Hartford Convention's terms in Washington, D.C. And while they were there, news of the Treaty of Ghent arrived, signaling the end of war, and the announcement that the war ended made the Federalists appear subversive and treasonous, and the Federalist support rapidly declined, and within a few years, the party itself is going to completely vanish. So when we look at reasons why the Federalist Party ceased to exist, we blame the Hartford Convention as one of those. You see here a political cartoon. This was by William Charles that reflects his interpretation of the Hartford Convention. The man on the cliff at the far left, you see him. Poor little I, what will become of me? This leap is of a frightful size. I sink into despondency. I know it's hard to see, so I'm going to tell you a little bit what it says. The central figure on the cliff. I cannot, brother Mass, let me pray, and fast some time longer, little road will jump first. And the third man on the cliff is saying, what a dangerous leap, but we must jump, brother Con. You can guess what states they represent. And the man under the cliff He says, I strongly and most fervently pray for the success of this great leap, for which will change my vulgar name into that of Lord of Essex. God save the King. This is a reference to the British. And the man at the far right, oh, 'tis my Yankee boys, jump into my fine fellows, plenty of molasses and codfish, plenty of goods to smuggle, honors, titles, and nobility into the bargain, and we know that represents the King of England. The still at the lower left reads, this is the produce of the land they wish to abandon, and lists the names of American notables in the War of 1812. If we have time, we're going to look at some questions associated with this cartoon in class. Again, if we have time. Tensions between the U.S. government and territorial and state governments on one side and Native American tribes on the other continue to increase during the War of 1812. Andrew Jackson, who was a commander of the Tennessee militia, played a particularly significant role in fighting Native Americans on behalf of the U.S. government. Jackson specifically aimed to open Alabama to white settlement, which would require defeating the Creek Indians there. Factions of Creeks were engaged in conflict with each other in the Creek War, and the U.S. is going to become involved. So Jackson gathered an army of Tennessee militiamen and Cherokee, Choctaw, and Lower Creek Indians to fight against the Red Stick Creeks, who followed Tecumseh and vigorously opposed the U.S. coming into their land. So on March 27, 1814, Jackson and approximately 2,000 troops fired cannons into the Red Stick strongholds near Horseshoe Bend in central Alabama. And they're going to kill approximately 800 of these Red Stick Creeks in a 5-hour battle. As a result of their defeat at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, these Creeks are going to sign the Treaty of Fort Jackson, ceding half of Alabama and part of Georgia to the U.S. This treaty is going to anger the Creeks, who had supported Jackson, as it involved their land as well as that of the Creeks. So Jackson made no distinction between his supporters and his enemies, and in his mind, they all stood in the way of U.S. expansion. Let's think about that for a minute and kind of keep that in our mind as we move towards talking about Andrew Jackson. He doesn't care who you are. If you stand in the way of what he wants, he's simply going to disregard you. Although the War of 1812 greatly increases the U.S. debt, it also proved financially taxing to Great Britain. And tired of paying to fund the war, the British public is going to call for a treaty to end it. So in August of 1814, representatives of the two countries are going to sign a treaty in Ghent, Belgium, to officially end these hostilities. Unfortunately, military forces back in America don't hear about the Treaty of Ghent in time to prevent the Battle of New Orleans. And this was the largest of the war, and in January 8, 1815, over 8,000 British troops were going to attempt to capture New Orleans. Under the command of Andrew Jackson, American troops fought off the British attack, and they're going to inflict about 1,500 casualties. And although this was very costly to Britain, very few Americans are going to die at New Orleans. So the Treaty of Ghent stipulated that all territories revert back to their pre-war ownership status, as if the war had never happened. So neither the British nor the U.S. are going to gain any territory through the War of 1812, and neither the war nor the treaty overtly settles any problems that had led to the war, including American concerns over British harassment of our trade ships. But nevertheless, the two countries are going to make peace, and the tensions gradually dissolve. Let's look at some discussion questions over this very, very lengthy video. So, number 1, what was Jefferson's rationale for passing the Embargo Act? Did it achieve its desired effect? Number 2, what led to the Battle of Tippecanoe and who fought in it? And number 3, what were the delegates to the Hartford Convention trying to achieve? What was the convention's outcome?